audio sound for the camera.
my sister. I love like this very much. I need to
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt all these conversations, but I have to call the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife to order. Our subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the state of fisheries. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman, the ranking member, the vice chair, and the vice ranking member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Well, I appreciate everyone joining us today. This will be one of the last of our WOW 101 hearings on the state of fisheries. These are a series of hearings we've established where we try to establish a baseline of facts for this committee to move forward and address the many challenges facing our water, oceans, and wildlife. And today we focus on fisheries. That's an important issue for my district, for the United States, and really for the entire world. Healthy and sustainable fisheries are not only important to the millions of Americans who love their seafood, they are important to people's livelihoods, to coastal economies, and to cultural practices. In the United States alone, fisheries represent a $212 billion a year industry. That includes providing 1.7 million jobs. Since the original passage of the Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1976, the state of U.S. fisheries has improved dramatically. The number of overfished stocks and stocks subject to overfishing are both at an all-time low and have been for the past several years. And by the way, we use this term overfished, and it is one of the things that I hope we'll reconsider and work on as we go forward, because there are some cases where fisheries are closed and that has nothing to do with fisheries, fishing, such as the salmon fishery in my district. It's a little bit disparaging, but it's a technical term that is used in Magnuson and other places. So when I say overfished, please don't think I'm blaming fishermen for every time a stock is depleted. Depleted might be a less pejorative and more objective term. In any event, we now have over 40 rebuilt stocks. I hope we can all agree that when implemented correctly, the Magnuson Act has been successful in supporting a robust domestic fishing industry. This is true in my district, where fishermen went through several tough years with groundfish stocks when they were depleted. Magnuson Act provided the scientific and regulatory framework to bring them back, in addition to a lot of hard work and support from commercial and recreational fishermen. We've now rebuilt half of our groundfish species, and more are on the way. We have, of course, new challenges along the North Coast. The law, however, provides a strong foundation for us moving forward. This committee intends to maintain the important conservation and management standards in the Magnuson Act that have helped us end overfishing or depletion and rebuild a record number of stocks. But I also know that there is room for improvement. I'm interested in learning how we can strengthen Magnuson to protect our fishing communities and ensure sustainable fisheries for future generations. For example, fishermen on the water and regional managers in the councils are already struggling with the management implications and challenges of shifting fish stocks due to climate change. On the West Coast, particularly in my district, fishermen have been severely impacted by changing ocean conditions that are resulting in devastating fishery closures, such as what happened to the Dungeness crab and salmon fisheries in recent years. We need to figure out what modifications to Magnuson make sense to help us address these new emerging issues and better support impacted communities. We also need a better system for getting fishery disaster funds out to impacted communities much more quickly than what we're seeing right now. I also know that protecting our commercial fishing communities will require increased accountability, transparency in decision-making, and improved data collection, use, and management. I've started a robust process to meet with stakeholders across the spectrum from all regions and all sectors to address fisheries management issues in the 21st century and look at how we can build on the success of Magnuson. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and welcome input from all other members on what is needed to ensure healthy, sustainable fisheries in a changing ocean. We'll also use today's hearing to explore a wider range of issues facing fisheries today, specifically illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, referred to as IUU fishing. This is an important subject. The United States is one of the top importers of seafood. Over 80% of the seafood we eat in this country is imported. IUU fishing is estimated to represent as much as 15 to 30% of annual global catches. It generates between $10 and $23 billion per year. And recent reports have shown that some fisheries are just flush with inhumane and forced labor practices. The State Department's Trafficking in Persons report identified 50 countries that have human trafficking and other human rights abuses just within their seafood supply chains. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I hope this is something we can all work on together. In addition, numerous studies have shown that when you order seafood at a restaurant, you may not be getting what you think you ordered. One study found that 1 in 3 seafood samples were mislabeled nationwide. And since we can't have a hearing on fisheries without mentioning red snapper, I have to note that some studies tested 120 samples labeled as red snapper, but results showed only 7 were actually red snapper. So seafood fraud is also an issue that affects everyone. I look forward to including that in our conversations. Around the world, we all depend on healthy fish stocks and thriving coastal economies. We have good examples to follow, but we also have a lot of work to do to improve the state of fisheries in the U.S. and globally. And I look forward to tackling these issues together in the subcommittee. With that, I want to invite Ranking Member McClintock to say his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee meets today to hear testimony on the state of our fisheries. Recreational and commercial fishing industries are significant drivers of the U.S. economy. Together, the U.S. seafood industry and recreational fishing generate $208 billion in sales impacts and contribute $97 billion to the U.S. gross domestic product. Additionally, these industries support upwards of 1.6 million U.S. jobs. The sustainable management of our American fisheries is of utmost importance to these sectors of our economy and the families that depend on it for their livelihood and the millions of consumers who depend on it for their dinner tables. The importance of this subject requires a clear-headed and accurate assessment of conditions and stocks. According to NOAA, 91% of stocks for which we have assessments are not subject to overfishing and 84% are not overfished. Further, nearly 90% of federally managed fisheries fall below their annual catch limits, meaning that our commercial and recreational fishermen are not being allowed to harvest at maximum sustainable levels. According to testimony received in 2013 by this subcommittee from Dr. Ray Hilborn, a professor of marine science at the University of Washington, quote, "The major threat to sustainable jobs, food, recreational opportunities, and revenues from U.S. marine fisheries is no longer overfishing, but underfishing." We'll hear testimony today from both the recreational and commercial fishing industries that lack of access has been the major contributor to this underutilization of our fishery resources. In recent years, access for commercial and recreational fishing is eroded due to poor science, overbearing regulations, and abuse of marine protected areas such as marine national monuments and marine sanctuaries that often prohibit various fishing activities. Massive expansions of off-limits designations by both the Bush and Obama administrations are a big part of the problem that needs to be fully examined and remedied. For example, in August 2016, a single designation expanded the northwestern Hawaiian Islands Marine National Monument to an area 3 times the size of the state of California. Opponents of that expansion, such as former U.S. Senator Daniel Akaka and former Hawaii Governor George Ariyoshi, saw it as an act of federal overreach that would harm Native Hawaiian livelihoods and cultural practices. Both Akaki and Ariyoshi further suggested that such an expansion would impact Hawaii's ability to follow through with trust responsibilities to island natives. The very next month, the administration designated the first ever marine national monument off the Atlantic coast, shutting off nearly 5,000 square miles of ocean to any economic activity, including commercial fishing and energy exploration. These closures of vast amounts of federal waters to U.S. fishermen have done nothing but promote foreign fishing fleets that often sit and harvest seafood right outside the bounds of these monuments. Rigid, over-prescriptive federal fisheries management frameworks and shutting U.S. fishermen out of massive swaths of productive fishing grounds have directly contributed to the seafood trade imbalance and, in effect, promoted foreign fisheries. These same foreign fisheries utilize forced labor, unsafe and unsustainable fishing practices, and mislabeling of products entering American markets to compete with American fishermen. The best way to combat foreign bad actors is to loosen the stranglehold we have needlessly imposed on our own American industry. Last Congress, with bipartisan support, the House passed H.R. 200, the Strengthening Fishing Communities and Increasing Flexibility in Fisheries Management Act. This legislation was composed of provisions aimed at getting better fisheries data to federal managers so that they can make informed decisions regarding our nation's fisheries, and afforded the necessary tools to regional fishery managers to tailor fishery management plans to the unique characteristics of their region. It promoted transparency in fisheries science and management, but sadly, this measure died in the Senate for lack of 60 votes for consideration. Sound science, accurate assessments, and sensible policy, rather than scaremongering and hysteria, is essential for policies that will assure the continued success of the U.S. fishing industry and the sustainable management of our American fisheries. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from a number of fishing groups known as the National Coalition for Fishing Communities outlining the practical impacts of Antiquities Act abuses. And with that, I yield back.
Without objection, that will be entered into the record. And I will now introduce the witnesses for our first panel on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The first witness is Ms. Judy Gearhart, Executive Director of the International Labor Rights Forum. Next will be Kitty Simons, Executive Director of the Western Pacific Fishery Management Council. After Ms. Simons, we will have Ms. Beth Lowell, the Deputy Vice President for U.S. Campaigns at Oceana. And finally, we'll have Ms. Jen Dianto-Kemmerly, Director of Global Fisheries and Aquaculture at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Let me just remind the witnesses, under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but the entire statement will appear in the record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, you'll see a yellow light come on to tell you you should begin winding up, and of course, you know what the red light means. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before members begin their questioning of the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Judy Gearhart. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here to testify on the state of fisheries and fishers. Since 2012, my organization, the International Labor Rights Forum, has been documenting and reporting on human rights abuses in the global seafood supply chain. We are advocating for greater legal protections for vulnerable migrant workers and have piloted a program to test connectivity at sea so that we can both improve catch documentation to prevent IUU fishing and survey fishers about their situation. Since 2013, we've been coordinating the Thai Seafood Working Group, a coalition of more than 60 labor, human rights, and environmental and civil society organizations which are working on the intersection of human trafficking and IUU fishing. I want to share with you some of the challenges in protecting seafood workers' rights. I'll draw on examples from our work in Thailand in order to illustrate the depth of work and coordination that's needed by both governments and industries alike. My conclusions will emphasize the need for greater transparency and accountability. The nexus between IUU and human trafficking is clear. In fact, IUU is made possible by the unfettered abuse of seafood workers. Fewer fish means vessels must go further out to sea and fish for longer periods of time using unsustainable methods, many of which fall under IUU fishing. And in order to afford the higher costs of distant water fishing, underhanded operators turn to illegal trafficking networks to supply cheap labor at the expense of vulnerable populations, often migrant workers. Thus, the same lack of monitoring, control, and enforcement that allows IUU fishing to deter conservation goals and deplete fish stocks is simultaneously contributing to the exploitation of workers in the fishing sector. Forced labor and the associated crime of human trafficking has been documented in supply chains of many seafood exporting countries, including Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. My written testimony provides details on all the efforts being made by the Royal Thai government to address forced labor and human trafficking. Since 2014, progress has been made in terms of new laws and policies intended to protect migrant fishers in particular. But significant problems continue, and leaders in the Thai seafood industry are resisting change. This was documented in a 2018 report by the ILO about the continuing problems. The prevention of human trafficking requires workers to have a means to speak out confidentially without fear of reprisal and to secure remedy. Yet in Thailand, the complex documentation process for migrant workers means many are still paying recruitment fees that put them in debt bondage. Additionally, the restrictions on migrant workers' ability to join trade unions and seek remedy further inhibit their ability to have a better situation. And in several cases, workers who did report labor abuses against certain companies were charged in criminal defamation suits for harming the company's reputation. Finally, fishers on boats are particularly vulnerable, as they usually have no means to communicate with support networks while they're at sea. The challenges to effective reform in Thailand illustrate how much more needs to be done. As a human rights organization, we believe national-level reforms and enforcement are absolutely necessary, and it's the duty of each state to protect the workers employed by the companies it governs. But global competition among seafood-producing countries will continually limit and create disincentives for national governments' ability to protect workers' rights. For this reason, initiatives to prevent IUU and stop human trafficking in seafood must consider market-oriented solutions that can address the role of global corporations and how they might, and seek a way for global corporations to be enlisted in the preservation of our oceans and the protection of seafood workers' rights. I have 3 specific recommendations. One is for the U.S. to take the lead on transparency and accountability. Federal legislation promoting greater transparency and accountability in corporate supply chains is needed. The UK, Australia, France, the Netherlands, and other U.S. allies have recently passed laws requiring multinational corporations to publicly disclose what efforts they are making to address the risk of forced labor in global supply chains. The U.S. should join and take the lead and lead by example in developing that legislation as well. The second is enforcement of existing U.S. laws, more robust enforcement of Section 1307 of the Tariff Act, which bans the importation of products made in whole or in part with forced labor, is important. We believe that leveraging greater data within the SIMP legislation can also contribute to the enforcement of the Tariff Act. The second is clarity from the U.S. government on how they enforce Executive Order 13627, which requires the U.S. government contractors to certify they have implemented anti-human trafficking compliance plan before they buy products. And the third is really we're calling on for a new social and environmental pact. There are precedents for a social and environmental pact between civil society and global corporations. There's one in Bangladesh that's been transforming the industry in fire safety and building safety, and there's one in Florida by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in the tomato industry. We believe that the coming together of civil society and corporations could be incentivized by government programs and policies in order to create a program with transparency, a meaningful role for workers, legal recourse for workers, and a commitment from global companies.
Ms.
Thank
Gerhardt,
you.
I hate to cut you off on such an important subject, but we're going to come back to this and give you a chance to expand on your opening remarks. Now we'll hear from Ms. Simons. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and committee members, especially Amua Amata from my part of the world. Under the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, the Western Pacific Fishery Management Council manages fisheries seaward of state territory waters of Hawaii, American Samoa, Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and 8 U.S. Pacific remote islands. Our region accounts for about half of the U.S. exclusive economic zone, and if you overlaid our region over the continental U.S., it would be from California to Maine. Our fleet includes 30 purse-seine vessels targeting skipjack tuna, 144 Hawaii-based longline vessels targeting big-eye tuna and swordfish, and 13 American Samoa longline vessels targeting albacore tuna. Our fisheries provide half of the fish consumed locally and the majority of the nation's domestic supply of big-eye and yellowfin tuna and swordfish. Our fisheries compete against much larger foreign fleets in the Western Pacific and Central Pacific Ocean. These foreign fleets, as you can see by the map there, operate up to the boundary of the U.S. EEZ, as shown in the global fishing watch maps, which we use, which are very, very useful for us. These maps reflect vessels that have their automatic ID systems turned on, and when they're turned off, you can't see where they're fishing. You can also see here where you see all the yellow dots. Those represent the foreign fleets: Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan. The pink, little pink that you see there represents U.S. fleets, and the blue area that surrounds the U.S. EEZs. You don't see much fishing in there, and as I said, if they turn their AISs off, you can't see what the foreign fleets are doing in our zones. So while U.S. and foreign vessels operate in similar geographic areas, the playing field is hugely uneven. We adhere to a broad range of federal legislation as well as federal regulations implementing international conservation and management decisions of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission and the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. Here are a few examples of the uneven playing field. The Hawaii longline fishery is subject to 100% observer coverage for its shallow set sector and has had 25% observer coverage for its deep set sector. Under the Commission's measures, longline vessels are to have 5% observer coverage. None of the foreign fleets consistently meet this requirement. Transshipment at sea, which is associated with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, is virtually non-existent in the U.S. longline fleet, but common practice in foreign distant water fishing fleets. The amounts of incidental interactions our fisheries have with birds, turtles, marine mammals, and sharks is known, and the impact of these interactions are negligible. However, the take of these species by foreign fleets is unknown. The cumulative impact of international and federal regulations threatens our U.S. fisheries. The tuna and billfish stocks, except striped marlin, targeted by U.S. fisheries in our region, are healthy, being neither overfished nor subject to overfishing. Yet, the amended Billfish Conservation Act prohibits their commercial sale to the U.S. mainland. Globally, the Hawaii fishery is considered the gold standard for sustainable pelagic longline fishing. Yet, the Commission has set the U.S. quota at a level that is not optimal to our fleet's capacity and local market demand. The reduced access to fishing grounds in the U.S. EEZ to the fishing prohibitions established by Marine National Monument designations force our fishermen out of more than half of the U.S. EEZ in the WCPO. This adds operational costs and travel time to our fisheries and eliminates their ability to detect illegal foreign fishing in our EEZ. This displacement of fishing effort has no conservation benefit to tuna and other highly migratory stocks or to protected species. The Marine National Monument fishing prohibitions, coupled with areas closed under the Magnuson-Stevens Act and Marine Mammal Protection Acts, leave only 17% of the U.S. EEZ around Hawaii open to our local longline fleet. I mean, what is that? In American Samoa, the combined impact of foreign competition and limited access to U.S. EEZ waters has reduced the local longline fleet from 70 vessels to 13, reduced its catch by 70%, and closure of one of the 2 local tuna canneries, while China's South Pacific albacore catch has increased to 50% of the total catch for all countries. The catch by American Samoa has decreased to 2% of the total catch. China's longline vessels just a few years ago were numbered 50. They now have 400 longline vessels fishing the same fishery that we're fishing there. Our fishermen are also confronted with potential closure of 30% of the high seas. These closures would be promulgated under the United Nations framework being developed to address biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, BBNJ. Proposed fishery closures in a Greenpeace map includes the high seas abutting the U.S. EEZ around Hawaii archipelago, Alaska, the entire East Coast, and most of the West Coast of the United States. In closing, I thank the committee members for your time to hear about the state of fisheries in the Pacific, and I hope you'll have a chance to read my entire statement and other information that we'll be sending. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lowell for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Beth Lowell. I'm the Deputy Vice President for U.S. Campaigns at Oceana. I would like to thank Chairman Huffman and the committee for inviting my testimony on the state of fisheries today. Oceana is an international conservation organization dedicated to protecting and restoring the world's oceans. Oceana campaigns for policy changes to save the oceans and feed the world. With science-based management, fisheries can rebuild and communities can continue to fish into the future. The key pillars of fishery management include setting scientifically based catch limits, protecting habitat, and reducing bycatch, the incidental catch of non-target fish and ocean wildlife. The good news is that when these measures are put in place, fish come back. In Japan, protecting habitat from bottom trawling increased the snow crab catch by 240%. In Norway, a ban on discards of unwanted fish allowed cod to rebound at 18% per year. And here in the United States, after reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act that helped establish catch limits, the stock subject to overfishing dropped from 38 to 9%. But all of these successes are undercut by illegal, unreported, and unregulated IUU fishing, seafood fraud, and other illegal activities like forced labor and human trafficking. Not only do these threaten the health of the world's oceans, but undermine fishermen and seafood businesses that follow the rules. IUU fishing is off the books, ignores fisheries laws and regulations, including fishing without a permit, using prohibited gear, fishing in closed areas, underreporting of catch, and ignoring quotas, and amounts to an estimated global loss of up to $23 billion per year. And as much as 32% of imported wild-caught seafood is a product of illegal and unreported fishing. Seafood fraud complicates fishery management, cheating consumers, and undermines honest seafood businesses, specifically species substitution, where one fish is sold as another, often a lower-priced fish sold as a higher-priced option. It can also hide health and conservation risks and the true origins of the seafood. Oceana's investigations found that more than 30% of the seafood we tested at restaurants, grocery stores, and markets was mislabeled. One of the most shocking finds, which you mentioned earlier, was that only 7 of the 120 fish that we tested sold as red snapper were actually red snapper. We also found farm shrimp sold as wild caught in the Gulf of Mexico and imported fish sold as local favorites around the U.S. The Food and Drug Administration tested seafood also at the wholesale level and found 15% of the lots they tested were mislabeled. We also reviewed more than 200 studies from around the world, where 1 in 5 of those the fish tested were mislabeled. Recognizing the impacts of illegal fishing and seafood fraud, the federal government put in place import controls on seafood that address legality and proper labeling of fish. The Seafood Import Monitoring Program, SIMP, requires some imported seafood at risk of illegal fishing and seafood fraud to be accompanied by catch documentation that provides key information like who caught it, where and how it was caught, and what specific species it is. This information is used to establish that it was caught in a legal fishery, and that this fish is also required to be traced from the U.S. border back to the original point of harvest. This was a huge first step in ensuring that the U.S. is not providing financial support to pirate fishing and seafood fraud. But it won't solve the problem alone. SIMP only applies to 13 types of seafood, and traceability measures stop at the U.S. border. We know that illegal fishing can happen in any fishery, and seafood fraud can happen at every level of the supply chain. To make matters worse, consumers are often provided with little information about the seafood they eat. They should be able to know things like what fish they are buying, where and how it was caught, to allow them to make more informed decisions based on health, sustainability, or other factors. For example, tuna can be a best choice, a good alternative, or a species to avoid, depending on these details. And the FDA's guidance on mercury is dependent on the species. Without more information about their seafood, consumers are left in the dark. Finally, with technology, we can shine a light on what's happening beyond the horizon. We saw the Global Fishing Watch maps earlier, which shine a light of what's happening at sea. Expanded use of vessel tracking tools would provide more transparency about commercial fishing activity, enhancing risk-based enforcement, and the verification of catch. Expanding documentation requirements to all seafood, extending traceability through the full supply chain, improving consumer labeling, implementing robust verification, and requiring documentation sufficient to determine that seafood was not a product of forced labor and human trafficking would level the playing field for U.S. fishermen and seafood businesses. Oceana welcomes the opportunity to work with the committee to ensure that all seafood sold in the United States is safe, legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. The committee now recognizes Ms. Kemmerly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee for the invitation to speak before you today. My name is Jennifer Dianto Kemmerly. I'm the Director of Global Fisheries and Aquaculture at Monterey Bay Aquarium. For more than 20 years, our Seafood Watch program has worked to build a market demand for environmentally responsible seafood to help advance domestic and global efforts in support of sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. Our science-based assessments on the sustainability of fisheries guide responsible procurement by U.S. retailers and food service companies, which in turn play an important role in incentivizing seafood producers to improve harvest practices and to advocate for effective management of the resource. Why do sustainable fisheries matter? Over 3 billion people worldwide rely on fish as their primary source of protein, and over 40 million jobs around the world also rely on a robust fisheries sector. Today, the leading U.S. retailers and food service companies have made very time-bound, public-facing commitments to sustainable seafood sourcing, and they're motivated largely by concerns with the availability of the future supply. Given the significant role of fisheries in contributing to food security and economic stability, it's important to understand the status of that supply and the activities that can negatively impact their long-term viability. According to the FAO, 33% of global fish stocks are fished at an unsustainable level, and approximately 60% of stocks are at capacity, meaning they cannot sustain additional pressure to meet the growing global demand for seafood. Concerns about stock status are exacerbated by the persistence of IUU fishing, as we've heard from my fellow witnesses today. This undermines national and regional efforts for effective management. And importantly, when we look at the term sustainability, we are looking at four things, not just stock health, but also the impacts of the fishery on other species, the impacts of the fishery on the surrounding ecosystem, and the effectiveness of management. So let's see how global fishery production is faring against these basic tenets of sustainability. Of the fisheries that Seafood Watch has assessed, only 1% of global production is green rated, which means these fisheries have performed well against all those sustainability criteria I just mentioned. Monterey Bay Aquarium encourages our broad consumer and business audiences to preferentially source from these fisheries. 4% are yellow rated, indicating some improvements are warranted to achieve sustainability. An additional 13% are eco-certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, whose standard we recognize is comparable to that of Seafood Watch. 5% of global fisheries are red rated, indicating significant need for improvement. Importantly, the sustainability status of 60% of global fish production is largely unknown, but what we do know is it's largely coming from regions with weak governance. Here's the good news. The picture can drastically improve with strong science-based management. This is a snapshot of U.S. fisheries performance. I think it really reinforces a lot of the points that we've heard today in the opening remarks. U.S. fisheries perform very well, mainly because stock status and management effectiveness are particularly strong. This sets the U.S. apart from most foreign fisheries. In fact, Seafood Watch recommends 91% of U.S. fishery production by volume for our discerning consumer and business audiences. Implementation of the Magnuson-Stevens Act has been key to the success of U.S. fisheries sustainability. We've identified several recommendations that we believe can help the U.S. maintain this competitive advantage and its role as the global leader in sustainable fisheries management. We ask that the United States maintain the core conservation provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, including science-based management, prevention of overfishing, and the rebuilding of overfished stocks. We ask for the support of investments in research, monitoring, technology, and innovation to guide management decisions. We ask, and this one I feel is very important based on some of the conversation I feel we're going to have in a moment, that we work with fishing communities to build critical infrastructure, supply chains, value chains, and domestic marketing opportunities. We ask that we incorporate ecosystem-based approaches to management to fully realize sustainability. We ask for the increased transparency and traceability of imported seafood products through full implementation of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, a point that's been raised by, I believe, most of our fellow witnesses here today, and expand the program to include all seafood products. We asked for increased government oversight by NOAA, the State Department, and other agencies to ensure our markets are supporting safe labor practices and social responsibility. We ask for enhanced enforcement capacity to address IUU fishing at sea and the imports of illegal product at our borders. The United States must continue to be a global leader for science-based, environmentally sustainable fisheries management. Working together, the public and private sectors can continue to strengthen U.S. fisheries and leverage our purchasing power to bring global fisheries up to these standards. The aquarium stands ready to work with Congress and this subcommittee to support solutions that ensure the long-term health of our oceans fisheries in U.S. waters and beyond. Thank you for the consideration of these remarks.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the witnesses. A special thanks to several of you for including specific recommendations as part of your opening remarks. That's helpful to get this conversation started. The first member to begin questions, we're going to go a little out of order because Mr. Sablon needs to preside on the floor. So with the concurrence of his colleagues, we will start with Mr. Sablon for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing. Welcome to all the witnesses. I am going to start by asking Ms. Simons, the 2018 Omnibus required all fisheries councils and funds to undergo audits. The committee has received no audit documents for the Western Pacific Sustainable Fisheries Fund managed by Westpac. I am concerned that the audit found 2 deficiencies in your accounting methods. I would like to ask you about 2 specific contractors with whom Westpac worked. From 2014 to 2017, Westpac had 2 contracts with Mirai Info Design, LLC, for nearly $100,000 to design alternative models for estimating catch in the Western Pacific. When committee staff looked into Mirai Info Designs, we found a share of a website which doesn't indicate this firm's abilities to conduct this kind of research. Looking into this further, we find that the listed agent for Mirai is Sunny Hospital. Ms. Hospital appears to be a real estate agent for her day job. But additionally, she is married to an economist with the National Marine Fisheries Service in Honolulu, who participated in an economic study that concluded that marine monuments would result in revenue loss for the longline fishing industry based in Honolulu. To my knowledge, the industry seems to be doing fine as it continues to use its quota quickly enough that the fishing fleet purchases additional quotas from the U.S. territories. So the industry is not losing money because of marine monuments. In any case, I'm concerned about the lack of transparency here. So can you please explain Mirai Info Design's qualifications for this work and how you came to determine that it would be appropriate to hire Mirai? Ms. Simons?
Thank you, Mr. Zablon. That's a very complex question. But I can tell you that while I don't, and the council does not fully get involved in, you're talking about the sustainable fisheries funds, that those funds are used by the territories for projects from marine conservation plans that are the governor's plans, and those plans are approved by the Secretary of Commerce.
So
I can't tell you.
Who paid Mirai?
Pardon me?
Who approved the contract
may I
for
say this,
Mirai?
that I am not familiar with all of the contracts, and I will have to get back to you about this question.
My other question is, even if you have to get back, is why there is not a conflict of interest here. So can you provide the committee with copies of this and all contracts and grants from the council that arise from the Pacific Fisheries Sustainability Fund, please?
Yes, we'll be happy to, and I think we have provided you those pieces of information in the past, and we will continue to do so.
Well, I'd ask again. Ms. Simons, does the Western Pacific Fisheries Council, Westpac, keep records of any and all requests for input from federal, state, or territorial bodies, legislative bodies?
Pardon me?
Does Westpac keep records of any and all requests for input from federal, state, or territorial legislative bodies?
Yes, we do. If we're asked questions, we respond.
Okay, so would you be able to send all requests from the past 10 years to this committee, please?
Yes, I believe you did request that, and we'll be happy to do that.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Simons. I got a minute left. Oh, boy. And let me ask you, Ms. Simons, do you think it's okay to, I'm going to have additional questions that will
Certainly.
Do you think it's okay to kill whales and sea turtles to catch tuna in excess of applicable quota?
Pardon me?
Do you think it's okay to kill whales and sea turtles to catch tuna in excess of applicable quota?
The council, and neither does Mrs. Simons, support what you've just said.
So you think it's okay to kill whales?
No, it isn't.
It isn't. But then, recent studies have shown that, for example, and talk about this in 2017, and most recent data yet available to the public, The Hawaiian fleet caught just under 110,000 sharks, but only kept 902. The oceanic white-tip shark, which has declined more than 90% since 1995, and shark is dear to my heart, is caught by the Hawaii longline fleet, was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 2018.
Yes.
NIMF is now required to publish a biological opinion once this listing occurs. 110,000 sharks. You think that was okay?
Well, let's put it this way. Assessments are being done, and we have an ongoing development of a biop based on the condition of the oceanic shark.
Just one more. My time is over, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Simons.
And we will make sure that the witness has a chance to respond to questions in writing. The chair recognizes Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. I want to especially welcome the panel and special talofa to Seutatia, Ms. Simons, who always makes time to speak with my office when she's here in town. My questions are addressed to Ms. Simons, but the rest of the panel should feel free to chime in. Ms. Simons, in your testimony, you write that the U.S. fisheries operating in the WCPO are among the most highly regulated, monitored, and enforced fisheries in the world. This is something we should be very proud of, but is there any risk that we've hobbled ourselves in the name of environmental discipline while ignoring potential bad actors? How should we be encouraging other countries to adopt this attitude of stewardship and care? And expanding on that, what impact do the fishing habits of other countries have on the U.S. fisheries and U.S. markets?
Well, as you will recall, the work that we do, the work that we establish, that we, the councils, have established, we take to the international commissions. So our highly regulated fisheries, in terms of turtles and birds and sharks and data collection, we have taken all of those to the international commissions, and they have adopted these measures. What we don't know is, following the commission meetings, when all the countries agree, the United States, I think, is the only country that comes home and actually implements them in national legislation. So one of the things that I think the United States could do is to do a survey of all the countries to see how many of them are actually adopting commission measures.
Ms. Simons, how do we even the playing field? And do you believe the increase in mislabeled seafood has anything to do with the lack of available domestic product?
Well, the lack of domestic product, at least in our part of the world, is because of all the different regulations that we have. I mean, under the Magnuson Act, we impose very strict regulations on our fisheries. So couple that with international management closures to us, as you saw on one of the maps, in the Hawaiian 200-mile zone, our fishermen today can only fish in 17% of those waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Very good, thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Van Drew for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for having these hearings. Thank you all for being here. And I've asked unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from my New Jersey colleague and friend, Frank Pallone, Congressman Frank Pallone. In 2006, the Magnuson-Stevens Act amendments dramatically changed the way, as we all know, domestic fisheries are managed. And since the implementation of these policies, it has been widely acknowledged that the resulting requirements have had some benefits, but without question have also been troublesome. In fact, the National Marine Fisheries Service began revisiting these policies since 2012 after receiving concerns from managers and stakeholders. In addition, oversight hearings on this topic began in October of 2009, with hearings conducted periodically over the last 10 years. The result of these lengthy deliberations have highlighted the concept of flexibility, which is generally supported by the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Council Coordinating Committee, and was a reoccurring topic of the Managing Our Nation's Fisheries 3 conference. And I think perhaps it's time that Congress make flexibility a requirement of the Magnuson-Stevens Act as well by enacting bipartisan reform that is science-based and also does achieve fisheries management objectives. This issue is important to me. You know, when I came to Congress, I asked to be on this committee specifically because of fisheries and because of the issues that relate to them. In New Jersey, and sometimes people think of New Jersey always as high-tech and the financial industry and big pharma. Actually, a great deal of New Jersey is rural, a great deal of New Jersey is seashore, a great deal of New Jersey is fishing, and in fact, it was fifth in total sales. We did $8 billion came in, and it represents 17th in jobs, 52,000 jobs, and is a major industry and always on the top industries in our state. It really is very, very important. And through those years, I've felt and heard, I know a lot of fishermen. Fishermen in my district. This is where I live. This is where I've worked. This is the people that I know. They are my constituents, and they do not want to overfish. Good American fishermen do not want to hurt the ocean. They do not want to overfish. But they do want some flexibility, and they do want to be at the table. They want to be understood. They want to be heard. They want to have a voice. And I think whenever we do anything in government that affects the livelihood of people in such an intimate and personal and powerful way as this does, that this is our responsibility, those of us that govern, those of us that are in leadership. So I hope as this process goes along that we certainly do that we bring them in, and I know that we are, and that we listen to them, and at the end of the day come up with some sort of a compromise that works, that maintains the fisheries, that maintains sustainability, that maintains the purity of what we want to do, yet at the same time has common sense, science-based regulations that do allow some flexibility. I ask that from everybody, Mr. Chairman. I really do. And, you know, I would say that no one understands the impacts of shifting fish stocks more than commercial and recreational fishermen. But before I just keep talking myself, let me just ask a question here. Ms. Lowell, it's estimated that the IUU fishing could represent as high as 15 to 30% of annual global catches, and generate between $10 to $23.5 billion per year. Where is IUU fishing primarily occurring?
Illegal fishing is happening around the world, and I think that's why it's, oh, am I?
Yeah, hit that red.
Okay.
Red is on.
Okay. And so that's why I think it's really important that the United States has taken these measures to ensure that the seafood that's being imported into the United States has, or at least of the 13 species covered by SIMP right now, has the accompanying catch documentation to verify that it was actually coming from illegal
Any
fishing.
particular offenders, any particular area that's worse in your mind, any?
I don't necessarily have a particular region that is most at risk to illegal fishing. We found that it's happening around the world, and that's why it's really important that we expand the seafood import monitoring program to require that documentation of all seafood to ensure that U.S. dollars aren't supporting illegal fishing.
How much seafood do we import from other countries, percentage-wise? I'm not going to hold you to an exact number.
It's more than 90% of the seafood that's consumed in the U.S. is imported.
More than 90% is imported. And is there any way to confirm that the seafood was legally harvested? Besides making sure that it's okay, can we ensure that it's legally harvested from these other countries?
Yeah, so requiring that catch documentation, key information like vessel, unique vessel ID number, that the fishery had the permits to fish, the gear it used, where it was caught, some of those key elements that are required under the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, so Customs and NOAA can verify that this seafood was actually caught in a legal fishery before it enters the U.S. market.
Okay, last question. How does IUU fishing, how is it disadvantageous for U.S. fishing communities? And I know how it is, but I'd like you to say it, like my own in southern New Jersey.
So you think of U.S. fishermen that are following regulations and strict requirements under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. They have a cost of doing business that is following the law. And then they're selling their product into a market that up to 20 to 32% of imported seafood, a wild-caught imported seafood, can be from illegal fishing. So they're selling their product into a market that can have illegal fish in there.
And they're getting hurt.
And they're competing with illegally caught fish. That's right. So that's why it's important that we
Getting
address
less
illegal
money for the
fishing and
catch.
seafood fraud of all imports in the supply chain to ensure that U.S. fishermen are not being undermined by those problems.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I now have a few questions. We'll see if any other members come back, but then we'll allow the next panel to come up. I want to start with you, Ms. Lowell, and ask you about NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, the acronym. All right, April was the first anniversary of this coming into effect. This, of course, was initiated in order to protect honest U.S. fishermen through increased transparency in imported seafood supply chains and by preventing IUU caught and/or misrepresented seafood from entering U.S. commerce. So currently, I understand the program only applies to 13 imported species groups, and that's less than 40% of U.S. fisheries imports by volume and value. So I'd like to ask your thoughts, and other witnesses are welcome to chime in on this as well. But has the U.S. been able to close its markets to IUU and fraudulent seafood? That's one of my questions. And then the other is, do you think that the SIMP program is being implemented to its full potential? And if not, what should we do about that?
So I think the SIMP program was a great first step on putting import controls on the seafood coming into our country to ensure that it's safe and legally caught and honestly labeled. But with only applying to 13 types of seafood, it's leaving the whole rest of the seafood that we import without the required documentation. If you think of illegal fishing operators, you think of those that are mislabeling seafood, they're going to try to find a loophole to get seafood into our country that they want to sell to the U.S. So if you were selling illegally caught fish, you probably wouldn't label it as one of the 13 species covered by SIMP that are required to have the documentation requirements, which we have pushed for since the start of this program, to have the SIMP program cover all seafood, right, so there are no loopholes and ways around that those that are really good at getting around the law can find a way in. And then for implementation, I think, we are a year, 2 years in. I'm trying to think of what year it is. Sorry, I have a newborn.
I think 1 year.
But we are a year into implementation of the program. I think there's, NOAA's doing a great job, but there's probably more that can be done, including more resources for enforcement, expanding the program for sure, and ensuring that the importers are understanding the documentation information that's required, and that they are ensuring that the seafood coming in is legally caught and honestly labeled.
Other panelists want to jump in? Ms. Gearhart, do you want to talk about perhaps whether this could be expanded to help us do a better job on the human trafficking piece of the issue?
Yes, exactly. And to the comments about the New Jersey fishermen, I think they're also being undercut by human trafficking that's part of the making it cheaper to catch fish abroad, especially when you have countries like the ones that I mentioned where the rule of labor law is weak and the migrant workers aren't protected. This contributes to human trafficking and makes all of the IUU fishing cheaper. We piloted a program to combine using AIS data to look at how do we monitor, enable connectivity at sea so that fishers can connect into organizations that can support them in seeking their rights. And being able to pair that with catch documentation is something that we'd like to pursue, and we think it could help address both of these problems of undercutting American fishers. Thank you.
I would just add that SIMP, I agree with all the remarks that have been made so far. It does a great job at getting information to the importer on record. The U.S. consumer, the retail sector, the food service sector still has a very limited ability to pull that information through to the point of sale. So for your consumer who wants to go in and reward that U.S. fisherman and buy that well-managed product, they're still going to have a big challenge in accessing that data. You're going to have every segment of the supply chain voluntarily pulling that information through. So if we really want to ensure greater transparency and reward U.S. fisheries and strong fisheries management and create that level playing field, I also would love to see some more consideration of how we can get that data beyond the importers on record. Thank you.
My understanding is the EU has a slightly different system. They've got a red card, yellow card, green card system. Anyone want to comment on that?
Only that it was very effective to help us on Thailand and getting Thailand to make some progress and measures and ratifying Convention 188 on the ILO Convention on Fisheries. However, it's very much from the DJ Mari, so it's an environmental mechanism that we're looking at how do we leverage that in the future for labor rights, because we're not so sure we're going to be able to.
Okay. We are out of time for this panel. I want to thank all of you very much, and you are free to go. We will bring the second panel up. Alan, did you have questions of the first panel? Do you have any questions you want? Okay. Okay, good.
He may not want to introduce the guy from Recreational Fishing Alliance.
Okay. So while our second panel is taking their seats, I'll go ahead and begin introducing them. Our first witness will be Mr. Bob Dooley from Seafood Harvesters of America. Next will be Captain John McMurray. He's president of the American Saltwater Guides Association. Then we'll hear from Mr. Nick Cicero, who's on the board of directors of the Recreational Fishing Alliance. And our final witness of the day will be Dr. Rebecca Selden, a postdoctoral research associate at Rutgers University. Welcome, everyone. You heard my remarks to the previous panel about how this works, and so you know what the various colors on the lights mean. We will now begin by recognizing Mr. Dooley for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today regarding the state of our nation's fisheries. My name is Bob Dooley. I'm a lifelong commercial fisherman from Half Moon Bay, California, and a member of the board of directors of Seafood Harvesters of America. Seafood Harvesters is a national commercial fishing association comprised of 17 member organizations that represent a variety of fisheries on every coast. I'm also a member of the Pacific Fishery Management Council, but I'm not here today in that role. Over the past 40 years, we have come a long way in the management of our nation's fisheries for their long-term sustainability. We owe this success in large part to the management principles established in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. In 2013, when I last testified before the House Natural Resources Committee, I stated that the MSA is an excellent piece of legislation. I stand by that statement today. It is our foundational fisheries law, and we ensure a plentiful and lasting seafood harvest through prioritizing the science-based management it prescribes. For example, on the West Coast, the trawl fishery was declared an economic disaster in 2000 due to overfishing, brought on by a lack of accountability and unobserved regulatory discards. As a result, we had 10 groundfish species declared overfished. Many of these stocks carried a more than 45-year rebuilding schedule. With the 2011 implementation of 100% industry-funded observer coverage, uncertainty was eliminated. As of last year, 8 of those overfished species were declared completely rebuilt, and none remain overfished. This is a result of full accountability and science-based management. Secondly, I'd like to discuss the rising cost of observers in our commercial fisheries. We need a base level of human observer coverage in our fisheries. It's undisputable and supported by harvesters. However, as costs continue to rise, upwards of $500 a day in our region, carrying observers on all vessels becomes an extreme economic burden, especially for smaller vessels. Harvesters strongly believe in full accountability, but we think there is a scalable and more cost-effective way to achieve that. Electronic monitoring and integrated logbooks are showing great promise. Many pilot programs are proving to deliver cost-effective catch accounting tools. It is critically important that while regulations are being developed governing their use, that we are keenly aware of the cost associated with their adoption. We should avoid prescribing a Cadillac when all we need is a Chevy. Regardless of who pays the tab, industry or government, we must have a common goal of reducing costs while achieving a reasonable amount of certainty in our data and management. Third, I'd like to talk about the impact climate change is having on our fisheries. Commercial fishermen will be the first to tell you about the changes they've seen on the water in recent years. These changes are creating additional fishing restrictions and closures that cause significant economic losses. We must recognize that fisheries are part of the ecosystem and the necessary resources must be provided for the industry to continue its mission to remain the frontline stewards of our marine resources. We can't turn fisheries on and off and expect the communities that rely on them to remain viable. I encourage Congress to support the work that the councils and NOAA are doing to develop frameworks that will allow the industry to have the tools to adapt and manage their fishing practices in the face of climate change. Lastly, I'd like to touch on NOAA funding. Without adjusting NOAA's budget to keep up with the rising cost of facilities, labor, and program execution, the agency will be hamstrung and unable to carry out their core missions. As an example, on the West Coast, we were recently informed by the National Marine Fisheries Service that 2 of the 4 contracted survey vessels will not be conducting surveys for the next 2 years due to budget shortfalls. This lack of survey data and the resulting uncertainty it produces will, over time, cost the West Coast fisheries millions of dollars in lost jobs and fish production. Our ability to feed good data into stock assessments depends on having the resources to do so. As I end my testimony here today, I would leave you with this one thought. Each fishing vessel is a business. I'm here today because I want to see the long-term sustainability and growth of not just our fishing resources, but also each business that operates on the water. As Congress considers the state of fisheries today, I hope you will recognize the great successes we've achieved over the past decade, but also look to tackling some of the issues I presented here. Thank you.
And thanks very much. The chair recognizes Mr. McMurray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Captain John McMurray. I'm the owner and operator of One More Cast Charters in Oceanside, New York, and the president of the American Saltwater Guides Association, and former 3-time Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council member. Let me be clear that we are not in a great place with the state of marine fisheries right now, but we are not in a terrible one either. The half-full part of the glass is exclusively because of strong federal laws that have succeeded in keeping a few fish in the water. Yes, there are anthropogenic factors out of the control of fishery managers, yet when managers are forced to constrain harvest, such resources do come back, often in good numbers. Well, there has certainly been criticism of the Magnuson Act, the 1996 rebuilding requirements, and the 2006 annual catch limit and accountability measures have been successful in forcing councils to prevent overfishing and rebuild overfished stocks, primarily because they isolated the process from the political pressure to allow short-term overharvest at the expense of sustainability and abundance. Yes, such mandates required we manage stocks more conservatively and that folks couldn't harvest small or as many fish as they had been. But when such harvest levels could be kept high, a large number of federally managed stocks were depleted. Prior to 2000, 92 federally managed stocks were overfished and 72 were subject to overfishing. Early last year, that number dropped to just 38 overfished stocks and 30 subject to overfishing. Still, there has been pushback since the 2006 reauthorization, calls to go back to the old way of doing things, to give federal managers the flexibility to avoid annual catch limits and accountability measures, legislative proposals that would allow numerous loopholes to the annual catch limit and accountability measure requirements, and calls to manage federal fisheries in a manner similar to the way states manage their fisheries. But the truth is that conservation provisions contained in the current version of the Magnuson Act cut the number of stocks being overfished by more than half. According to NOAA Fisheries, recreational participation in seafood landings are up as a result. That's because the conservation provisions of the Magnuson Act have increased access by making more fish available to more people. And that is the right way to manage a public resource. For my charter business, abundance equals opportunity, and opportunity drives participation. Almost 20 years in the charter business has taught me that having the opportunity to catch numbers of fish with the realistic hope of a large one is more important than simply being able to fill a cooler. On a personal note, my 10-year-old boy simply won't go fishing with me if there isn't a reasonable expectation that I could put him on bluefish or fluke or striped bass. And make no mistake, we are rapidly losing this part of the fishing demographic to video games. On the issue of managing federal stocks like the states manage their fisheries, one need not look any farther than the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. While their charter would seem to suggest that they prevent overfishing and rebuild stocks, they have no federal or other mandate to do so. The only stock the Commission has successfully rebuilt since it was created in 1942 was Atlantic striped bass. But again, striped bass is overfished, and overfishing is occurring now. Had striped bass been managed under federal law, that likely would have been avoided. It would be good to see the Commission have to comply with the same federal mandates that the councils do. No, federal fisheries management is not perfect. There have been issues with summer flounder and black sea bass in particular. Rebuilding has resulted in an increase in availability and catchability. That can lead to overfishing even when there are more fish around. As summer flounder demonstrated, those situations usually stabilize after a few years, once the stock reaches its biomass target and supply and demand begin to balance out. On the issue of ecosystem-based management, currently there are no requirements that predator-prey relationships receive full consideration. Catch limits for forage species must be lowered to account for such. The Mid-Atlantic and Pacific Councils have taken steps to prevent large-scale harvests from taking place on currently unmanaged forage species. This should be a mandate for all councils. On the issue of climate change, councils should be required to account for spatial and temporal shifts in stock distribution. For example, summer flounder has clearly shifted its center of abundance, yet the current allocation of commercial landings is not reflective of that. New York in particular has been on the losing end of that. Climate change also provides another reason to keep strong conservation provisions in the Magnuson Act. Maintaining stocks at high levels renders them more resilient in the face of changing environmental conditions. Finally, data collection must receive adequate funding, especially on the recreational side. The current MRIP survey, while good for determining regional trends over time, is not well suited for state-by-state, year-by-year management. While it now represents the best available science, we can and should do better. In short, fishery managers face serious environmental challenges in the form of climate change, pollution, toxic runoff, and similar problems they can't control. But one thing they surely can control right now is the harvest of marine resources. Making sure we have well-funded agencies to manage those resources and strong laws that ensure their abundance and resilience in the face of the many environmental challenges is well within our realm. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cicero for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to appear before you today. My name is Nick Cicero, and I'm the sales manager of the New Jersey-based Folsom Corporation. We are one of the nation's oldest and largest wholesale distributors and manufacturers of fishing tackle. We employ almost 200 people, and all our livelihoods depend on healthy fisheries, fair and equitable access to that resource. I also serve on the board of directors at the Recreational Fishing Alliance, a national organization that represents saltwater anglers. Statistically, we're losing saltwater anglers and recreational fishing businesses too. New Jersey, for instance, angler registration numbers have fallen by roughly 39% over the last 5 years, while the number of registered charter boats and party boats is down 26%. These numbers show that both anglers and businesses have disappeared, ironically, in an era of economic prosperity. How can Magnuson be a success if we have healthy fish stocks, yet at the very same time we've lost fishermen, boaters, and local businesses? The original intent of Magnuson had a very clear objective: to promote domestic, commercial, and recreational fishing under sound conservation and management principles. Unfortunately, this objective has been hijacked, and it's been turned into a weapon against the very people it was designed to protect. We're not talking about glamorous game fish like striped bass or blue marlin or snook or sailfish here. What we're talking about here today that Magnuson manages is mixed-use commercial recreational fisheries, which are either rebuilt or on a very positive upward rebuilding trend. Species like summer flounder, black sea bass, red snapper, sadly, they are prime examples of Magnuson's failures. The use of annual catch limits in the recreational sector was condemned by the RFA and other groups during the last reauthorization. Why? Because they just don't work in the recreational sector. The simple fact is these data collection tools were never designed, nor were they intended to be used to enforce annual limits. MRIPs may paint a stable picture, but it doesn't really match state numbers or the retail data that I work with on a daily basis. Let's use summer flounder, fluke, for an example. The powers that be recently agreed that the stock was so healthy enough to warrant a 40% increase in annual catch limits for the summer of 2019. And yes, the commercial folks got their 40% increase. Yet anglers this summer will enjoy a zero net gain. Not one more fish, not one more day at sea. Why? It's all because management has made it impossible to continue operating. Some are marketing the term abundance as a buzzword to add new layers of precaution, a strategy to further eliminate lower and middle-income anglers. Abundance is not a fisheries management term. It's a brand for some seeking to limit public participation in the fishery. The opposition is called H.R. 200, the Empty Oceans Act. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a scare tactic, purely a custom-made tactic for headline writers. Our hard-working American anglers were promised years ago that if we sacrificed in the name of rebuilt fisheries, that we would, in the future, at some date, be rewarded with fair and sustainable access. That's not what we have. Magnuson has become the real Empty Oceans Act. It has emptied the oceans of everyday anglers who make up our coastal communities. The true intent of Magnuson is clearly not being followed here. We're not managing for sustainability. We're managing for abundance and for preservation. It's a failed philosophy that's based on emotion and agenda, and it's killing our recreational shore communities. I think it's time for Congress to work with us to develop a plan that actually works, one that's fair, one that is sustainable for both the fish and the fishermen. Thank you for your time today.
Chair now recognizes Dr. Selden for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Dr. Rebecca Selden, and I'm a senior fellow for the Nereus program, Predicting Future Oceans at Rutgers University. I'm an expert on the impacts of warming on ocean ecosystems and the consequences for fishing communities. Fisheries are the lifeblood of many coastal communities in the U.S. and contribute billions of dollars to national GDP. The United States also has some of the best managed fisheries in the world. Our reliance on science-driven management has resulted in a dramatic improvement in the performance of our fisheries over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, warming waters threaten that continued success. Today, my testimony will focus on the impact of warming on fish and fisheries. I want to make 3 points. 1, marine species follow changes in ocean temperatures, often moving towards the poles and deeper as the oceans warm. 2, fishing communities are directly impacted by the loss of important fishery species and by the potential gains of new species within fishing grounds. And 3, management can be more nimble in dealing with distribution shifts. The sooner we act, the better we can ensure our fisheries continue to support jobs, food, and economies throughout our country despite ocean change. The risk that changing ocean conditions pose for fisheries was demonstrated by the warm blob on the West Coast between 2013 and 2016. A mass of unusually warm water, 2 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, spread from Alaska to Baja California, leading to mass starvation of seabirds, strandings of sea lions, and record low returns of coastal salmon. Fishery disasters stemming from these warm ocean conditions were ultimately declared for salmon fisheries in California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, with total losses exceeding $70 million. Unfortunately, extreme events like the warm blob are only predicted to get more frequent and more intense with continued warming. These impacts are added on top of long-term warming trends that are already stressing ocean ecosystems. Rapid warming the last few decades off the northeast coast of the U.S. has driven species to move northward to avoid warm water. For example, populations of black sea bass used to be centered off the coast of Virginia in the 1960s and are now off of New Jersey. On the Pacific coast, the changes have also been striking, where warming has allowed arrowtooth flounder to invade areas of the eastern Bering Sea. Flounder is a voracious predator of walleye pollock, the fish found in McDonald's filet-o-fish sandwich. Pollock is an important fishery, the largest by volume in the U.S., and it's at risk from increased predation by flounder. This suggests that fisheries will be affected not only by shifts in species that we harvest, but also by shifts in the predators and prey of important fishery species. Fishers are truly on the front lines in dealing with shifting fish stocks. Fishers in Rhode Island have observed black sea bass in the Gulf of Maine for the first time. Those in Massachusetts are now seeing year-round populations of summer flounder. And New Jersey fishers have told us that warming has, quote, left us with no squid to catch unless we travel 100 miles, and we are not those types of wanderers. This sentiment reflects similar experiences throughout fishing communities along the eastern seaboard. Large trawlers from North Carolina steamed 3 days north to catch summer flounder off the coast of New Jersey before returning home to land the fish, burning excess fuel and driving up costs. However, our research revealed that the vast majority of fishing communities continue to fish within their traditional fishing grounds. For most fishers, it is undesirable to move away from those places at sea where they have fished for decades, despite the changes they see on the water. Integrating shifting fish stocks into management is an issue likely to become even more important with future climate change. Black sea bass is projected to move another 300 miles north by 2100. Some species are expected to move more than 600 miles if emissions continue as they are now. Importantly, shifting species into new fishing areas may represent a valuable opportunity for emerging fisheries. However, with continued warming, the number of stocks straddling international boundaries is poised to increase. This highlights the value of using models that predict where we expect fish to go so that we can begin proactive management now to minimize future conflict. These types of models, in effect, let us drive with the headlights on so that we're not stumbling blindly forward in our efforts to make fisheries climate ready. At this point, the scientific evidence is clear. It's not whether species will move, it's when. Further, the more we stress ocean ecosystems with continued warming, the more severe events like the warm blob are likely to become. The good news is that we can make our management more nimble to deal with shifting fish stocks. Two needs I see based on my research are: one, to utilize the best available science to detect, anticipate, and respond to changes in fish stocks, and two, to coordinate management across jurisdictions where those species are likely to cross management boundaries. This committee can serve an important role in enabling that coordination and integration. I also want to emphasize that climate change makes it even more important to ensure fish stocks remain healthy and overfishing is not occurring, as depleted stocks are less resilient to climate change. Taking an integrated view of the impacts of climate and fisheries on marine resources will make it more likely that we continue to have healthy fish stocks and vibrant fishing communities for years to come. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. We'll now begin the questioning, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. So I want to start on this issue of some of the criticism we heard from Mr. Cicero, from his perspective in the recreational fishing community. And I want to ask Mr. Dooley and Mr. McMurray, because you have each sat on councils that are representative of a range of stakeholders that include recreational fishing interests in your regions, about that, because my sense from my conversations with stakeholders is that the fairly withering criticism of Magnuson that we heard from Mr. Cicero might represent the most critical end of the spectrum of stakeholder views on this. I'm also, lest we take away from that testimony that recreational fishing is in steep decline, I'd like to enter into the record a 2018 Sport Fishing in America report from the American Sport Fishing Association, which shows by the ASA's own data the total number of U.S. anglers increased 8% between 2011 and 2018, and fishing equipment sales grew more than 21%. There may be regional differences in how that growth pattern, has been experienced, but I did want that overall picture to be entered into the record. So if there's no objection, It will be entered in the record, and I'd just invite our two veterans of councils to speak to this if they would from their perspective.
Throw me to the wolves, huh? So maybe you could clarify the question a little more before I start talking.
Well, Mr. Cicero offered a very withering criticism of Magnuson from his experience. In your experience as a member of the council, is that a view of the recreational fishing community? Do you think it's fair? How do you respond to that?
Okay, thank you. Actually, no, I don't think it's fair. I think there's certainly part of the recreational fishing community who is disgruntled because they can't kill as many fish as they used to, or they can't kill as small fish as they used to. But there's another side of the angling community, and I probably argue it's the majority, who values the opportunity more than simply filling coolers. I mean, to them, it's about a day on the water. It's about the experience. And
do you think our passage of the Modern Fish Act last year will help address some of those who have not been happy with Magnuson?
I do. I think it'll address the data portion, the data collection portion. As you likely know, there's a mandated study that will look into better methods of data collection, and I think there's a lot of promise in electronic reporting, specifically smartphone apps, and there's still some issues that need to be worked out with those, and hopefully this study will do that. I think it's also, I think the passage of the Modern Fish Act will inevitably provide us more information to make better management decisions. Some of the more egregious parts of the original versions of that were taken out, and that was good to see. I think maybe the community realizes that the conservation provisions are what brought all these fish back in the first place. And
Mr. Dooley, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, I do. It took me a while to understand this through my fishing career of over 40 years, but everything you need to know about running a successful, sustainable fishery starts with accountability. Starts with knowing how much fish is taken out of the water and how much fish is being discarded and not accounted for or not monitored when it's delivered. I think that's a hard lesson to learn, and I think that it's produced unbelievable great results on the West Coast. Our recreational community probably doesn't fully agree that they're getting a fair shake, but you have a commercial sector that's in 100%, the trawl sector, that has 100% accountability, and we know every fish that's being caught. That isn't the case in the recreational sector, and the accounting isn't necessarily that good. And those lower limits and stuff that they're experiencing are because we have no accountability or low accountability. If we increase the accountability in those fisheries, we will have more fish, just like we did just like we had in our trawl fishery and rebuilding those.
Is your view that accountability is why we've had such a great turnaround in California and the West Coast? I know overall bycatch is down 75%. Lingcod was overfished in '99, rebuilt by 2005. And I've got to say, as a recreational angler, I thank you for that, because on Friday of last week, I was able to catch a 24-inch lingcod off my kayak, and I had a delicious dinner Saturday night as a result of that. So you agree that the accountability measures are a big reason why I was able to enjoy that lingcod? Absolutely, and I think it's even better than that, because because of increased accountability, we were able to increase that bag limit to 2 lingcod at the last council meeting, and I think that is due to a better increased accountability in the sector. So that's the key to freedom, is accountability. Appreciate it. The chair now recognizes Mr. Webster for 5 minutes. Ready?
Mr. Cicero, I know you've stated that if we're going to reauthorize Magnuson, we need to get it right. I think most people would say that that's true. What is it about even this last exchange of questioning, what is it that you would like to talk about in that arena that would make it right?
You want to push your button there, Mr. Cicero. Thank you. There you go.
My comments were misunderstood. Magnuson has done a spectacular job in rebuilding some of these species. Black sea bass, the recent stock assessment, It's the highest biomass that's ever been recorded. Summer flounder, fluke right now, are in such spectacular shape that they've seen fit to increase the quotas by 40%. My issue with Magnuson, the failing of Magnuson, is the lack of accessibility to that angling community that sacrificed all these years to produce these bumper crops of fish and have very little access to that very fishery. Here we have a black sea bass fishery that's the greatest biomass they've ever recorded in history, and yet we fish on one of the smallest quotas ever and one of the shortest number of days at sea. Understand that a businessman, whether he's in New Jersey or Massachusetts or Ocean City, Maryland, when we have these seasons where there's 20 days off between one species and another, 32 days off between this species and the next, they can't send their crew home. What do they do to them? Tell them, listen, come back in 37 days, I'll pay you when you come back. That's the problem. We need continuity of seasons. We need access to fisheries. That's my problem with Magnuson. Magnuson did a commendable job, and our fisheries are in better shape, way better shape, especially on these species that I spoke about today. And what we deserve and what we expect is better access.
So would that access be squeezed so that those time frames melt together, or is it you just need a longer time? What
I think we need more days at sea. We need more logical. I'll give you, for instance, let's talk about summer flounder, for instance. We have various techniques for management. One technique is days at sea. The other technique is bag limits. The other technique is size limits. In summer flounder, what we do is we not only limit the number of days at sea, we limit the bag limit, but we've also increased the size limit. In New York, it's 18 inches. In New Jersey, it's 18 inches. In New York, it's larger. And what that does is literally we target nothing but spawning class females. That's the sort of thing that these annual catch limits have forced the managers with lack of flexibility into doing. We end up doing things that are actually wrong, intuitively wrong for the fishery, just to simply meet these annual catch limits and these restrictions. We'd be much better off in something like the summer flounder fishery with a slot limit that would allow the retention of a smaller fish and not just target spawning class females. There's lots of little tweaks that could be done, but the bottom line is we need greater access to rebuilt fisheries.
Should there be anything in there about shoreside businesses?
Oh my God, listen, the days at sea, limits, availability, that's the engine that drives this whole thing. So it's not just the charter boat captain with 6 people on his boat or a party boat captain with 40 people on his boat. It's the shoreside restaurant that provides the lunch or the breakfast. It's the gas station that fills the tank. It's the ice house. It's the convenience store with the cup of coffee. It's the place on the way home that the guy buys a T-shirt for his kids. All of those things are driven by the engine, and the engine is the opportunity to go fishing and the opportunity to take something home. If I might for a moment, let me just describe to you a very typical New Jersey summer scenario. As Congressman Van Drew so well put it, New Jersey is a shore community. We have 120 miles of beautiful coastline, and lots of people flock to the state of New Jersey during the summer. And part of that summer experience is to take the kids fishing. It's a family day. They go out on for-hire vessels. That's where they typically go because they go with expert fishermen, and those for-hire vessels typically provide clean, safe environments and a good chance of catching something. Well, if you went on a typical August day on the Jersey Shore, you and your family, to go fluke fishing, you might very well catch 8 or 10 or 15 fluke. Mother usually catches most because she takes instructions well. The kids catch a few. Daddy gets a few. Nobody gets to take anything home. Not one of them made the 18-inch size limit. Kids are frustrated. Dad's questioning why he spent so much money. Wasn't such a nice day. Let's go play miniature golf tomorrow because at least we'll get what we paid for. But in that very same community, not a scant 100 feet from where that party boat docks, that family is welcome to walk down the street to the local fisherman's co-op and buy flounder fillets for $22 a pound.
Mr. Cicero, I'm going to now have to recognize Mr. Van Drew, but something tells me the conversation may continue under his watch or under his 5 minutes. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Van Drew for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and I just think this is a good conversation to have. I really do, for all of us. And maybe it's an East Coast thing a little bit too, and I will tell you, and I've read the same information as the Chairman, and there's no doubt that recreational fishing has grown in certain areas without question. I also will tell you that in the New Jersey area particularly, which I also think reflects on Delaware, perhaps New York, it has not. And very quickly from the business end, and you alluded to that, what is happening, and I have friends that are charter boat owners, and what they've done is they've changed them from being charter boat owners for fishing to party boats. And you know that, so now most folks are just going out to party and they're not fishing anymore. So that's part of the issue, is because they spend a lot of money and almost nobody comes home with any fish. And so I would think as the fishery is healthier and is more solid, and that there should be the possibility of bringing home at least a few fish, number one. Secondly, the point, I've heard it over and over and over again from fishermen, and not fishermen that just want to rape the ocean. These aren't bad people. They know, they're smart people, they're business people, they're environmental stewards, and they know that if there aren't enough fish in the ocean, that their business completely dies. They're not bad people that want to empty the oceans out. They're just not. The vast majority of them are not. But they also know that they have to run a business, and I know a lot of folks at the Recreational Fishing Alliance, and they are some of the biggest environmentalists that I know, and are always pushing me on environmental issues because they really care about these issues, and they really care about fishing as well. The nature of what children do has also changed. Much more watching television, much more video games, much more other, hunters talk about the same thing, not as much outdoors. So I think in order to make it enjoyable and for the business to thrive and for fishing to still thrive as a way of life, we have to make sure that we are being fair and we are being flexible and that we are being accessible. Now, do I believe that we can do that and still maintain the environment and still have Magnuson? Yes, we can. Magnuson has done wonderful stuff and saved a lot of fish. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that the businesses can continue to thrive, that fishing is something that still exists into the future, because it has dropped in New Jersey and in some of the states in the East Coast without question. And I guess the question I would ask everybody, because I think we all know to some degree that's true, what is it that we can do here to make it a little bit better? I'll ask you first, Mrs. Cicero, since you were the most candid about your view of this.
I think that really limits managers is this concept of annual catch limits. They work fine in a commercial fishery where you can count fish. They don't work fine in this scenario. For the MREPS data was designed to give you a snapshot of the fishery over a 3 or a 4 or 5 year period, not to micromanage on a year-to-year basis.
And by the way, has anybody determined why we are pushing people into catching and keeping the pregnant females?
No, you'd have
I don't understand that. Nobody can explain it to me. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. If I may, I'd like to address this spawning females issue, because I think there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about why the council set the limits that they set. An 18-inch summer flounder has spawned a few times. So in my view, it's okay to kill them then. It's not okay to kill them when they haven't spawned. Now, once you do something like a slot limit, and the recent analysis put forth by the Mid-Atlantic Council showed this to be the case. When you have a smaller fish, a smaller slot fish, that generally increases fishing mortality. It doesn't increase it because they're easier to catch. People catch them and kill them with more frequency. So it doesn't work in the management scheme. It seems intuitive, but that's not the way things work. So the trade-off really between having the flexibility to do those things and complying with the Magnuson's provision is that, and let me preface this by saying that I don't think anybody's evil here. I don't think anybody wants to rape the ocean. We all have differing opinions. We're all watermen, and we all spend time and embrace the resource. We just see things a different way. And maybe I'm jaded after spending so much time on the council, but the argument is always about how do we get around these annual catch limits? How do we get around these accountability measures? And if you don't have these hard provisions in the law, the councils are under a tremendous amount of political pressure to allow overfishing. Now, I don't want to take any more of your time, but I am just more concerned about the long-term sustainability and of this resource and the abundance that will allow me to have an easy day on the water, that will allow my kids to have the same opportunity that I have. And I would argue that Magnuson has worked to that effect. And sure, there are some fixes that could probably be made, but I really don't want to see us go backwards in time, back to the days of chronic.
Nobody does, and nothing's perfect. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll be quiet, is the first people that told me about climate change, the very first people, fishermen.
They feel it. Well, thank you. I'm going to now recognize Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Well, first I want to thank the panel and the members of the Congress. As someone who's not a fisherman, I find this very interesting and something I've learned a lot about. So my first question is really for Captain McMurray. You know, we've been discussing state management of fisheries. We discussed a while ago the red snapper, and now, so I'm asking you, the state management of the Atlantic striped bass is often held up as a success story of state management. But in your testimony, I believe it was written that it's the only success of many fish stocks that even the striped bass is overfished once again. In your opinion, why haven't more stocks been recovered by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission if, as others say, state management of these stocks works so well?
Thank you for that question. I could answer you very briefly.
Good, very brief.
It's because they do not have the same mandates that you find in federal law to prevent overfishing and to rebuild overfished stocks. And they are very subject to political pressure to allow continued overfishing. And I think the record is very clear on the success of that management body versus the success of the councils in rebuilding stocks.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up Captain McMurray. As a member of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, you helped lead an effort by that council to conserve unmanaged forage fish from overexploitation. You mentioned in your testimony that Magnuson-Stevens Act allows for but doesn't require unmanaged forage fish conservation. You also state that, and your quote was, an entire fishing season really revolves around forage concentrations. Now, we've talked about Atlantic species like the striped bass and the summer flounder. How would you require, or how would requiring fishery managers to account for the importance of forage fish to the ecosystem when setting a catch limit on forage fish species, how would this, if they did this, help support healthy fisheries in both the short and the long term?
Thank you for that question. This is probably going to require a little longer answer, but I'll do the best I can to keep it brief. So again, I think most fishermen would say this, that our seasons revolve around around forage fish aggregations. Without those fish think about one thing, or maybe
eating.
two things. Eating and, yes, spawning. much like human beings.
So that's exactly what I would say.
Right.
also.
But protecting those forage resources are very important in the context of sustaining important commercial and recreational fisheries. And fishermen are a innovative type, and they're always looking for new forms of income. So the council and me personally, of course, felt that there was a threat to species like sand eels that did not have significant large-scale fisheries on them yet. We felt that there was a significant potential to have those fisheries utilized by large-scale, high-volume, low-value fisheries, and that likely would have been catastrophic to my business as well as many other businesses up and down the coast. So we took proactive action, and we set caps. We determined what all the important forage species were in the Mid-Atlantic, and we set catch caps on those. And I want to be clear that if the science existed to allow those large-scale fisheries to exist, and if the science existed to show that they were sustainable, then of course, we could allow them to happen. But we needed the science beforehand and not after the fact. And I believe the Pacific Fishery Management Council did a similar action. But it's my view for the sustainability and continued existence of those important commercial and recreational fisheries, that should be a mandate for all.
Rather than just a recommendation to do this, it really should be mandated?
I think so, yes.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Terrific. I want to thank the witnesses very much for the valuable testimony. Feels like we just scratched the surface of some really important subjects and conversations that I know many of us want to continue in the weeks and months ahead, and I know that we will do that. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask the panelists to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and we'll keep the hearing record open for 10 business days to allow for your responses. If there's no further business, the subcommittee now stands adjourned. Thank you.
We should talk.
We should talk, yeah. You know, if you guys would allow more